Here is a case file that made a room full of kidney doctors go quiet. 9,062 adults. Ordinary people tracked for almost 9 years, and every one of them walked in healthy. No dialysis, no diabetes flags, nothing circled in red on the intake forms. The only thing that told one group apart from another was a sound in the dark. People who snored at least one night a week, just from that, turned out to be about 23% more likely to end up with damaged kidneys by the time the study closed. Roughly 8 out of every 100 of them developed it. 764 people out of that 9,000 whose filters quietly went bad. Now stop and look at that, because it is strange. A sound cannot reach through your neck and grab a kidney sitting down by your spine. There is no string, no wire, no little arm running from your throat down to the small of your back. A snore is air. It is a flutter of soft tissue. And yet the numbers keep turning up, one study after another, one country after another. So something is moving through the body at night, something we are not hearing. And by the time it shows its face in a blood test, it may have already been at work for years. That is the case I want to crack open with you tonight. And like any good case, we are going to start by ignoring the confession everyone wants to hand us and go back to the scene of the actual event. But first, let me convince you the case is real. Because one study is a rumor. You need the pattern. That group of 9,000, they were followed in Korea, in 2 communities from the year 2001 all the way to 2014. Mean follow-up almost 9 years. These were not sick people picked because they looked doomed. This was a slice of a whole town, and the researchers were careful. They did not just count snorers and shrug, they adjusted. They took out the effect of age, of weight, of blood pressure, of the usual suspects, and after all that scrubbing, the snoring still stood there with its hands in its pockets, guilty look on its face. The adjusted risk landed at about 1.23, which is a dry little number, so let me tell you what it means. It means the snore did not wash out. You could subtract everything else you could think of, and there was still a lump left over that only the snoring explained. Here is what I love about a number that will not go away. In physics, we chase those. You do an experiment, you correct for the temperature, the friction, the tilt of the table, and there is still this stubborn little wiggle in your data that refuses to leave. Most people call that an error and go to lunch. The good ones call it a clue. This snoring number is that kind of wiggle. It should have vanished when they cleaned the data. It did not vanish. So we have a body found at the scene, so to speak, and we have a suspect standing over it making a lot of noise. And the temptation, the very first temptation, is to arrest the obvious guy. Let me bring him in, because he is genuinely a good suspect, and any honest detective has to take him seriously before letting him go. The obvious suspect is fat. I will say it plainly. Heavier people snore more, because there is more soft tissue crowding the airway, and heavier people get more kidney disease. So the easy story writes itself in one line. Fat makes you snore, fat wrecks your kidneys, the snore is just an innocent bystander who happened to be standing near the crime. Case closed, everybody go home. And you know what? There is real evidence for that man. In a big American survey, close to 8,000 adults, they found that sleep apnea, the serious cousin of snoring, went along with more kidney disease. And then they did something clever. They asked, of that whole connection between the bad breathing and the bad kidneys, how much of it can we pin on obesity? How much of the effect flows through the fat? And the answer came back at about 30%, almost a third. There is another study, in China, middle-aged and older folks, and it found the snoring to kidney link showed up strongly in the obese people and basically did not show up in the normal weight people at all. So obesity is not a red herring you can just wave off. It is really in the room. It is holding part of the knife. But here is the trouble with pinning it all on him. 30% is not 100%. If obesity did the whole job, you would expect the link to melt away completely once you account for weight. It does not melt away. There is a big pile of effect left sitting on the table with obesity's fingerprints nowhere near it. so I cannot convict him for the whole crime. He is an accomplice. He is not the mastermind. And a good detective feels a little itch when the easy suspect only explains a third of what happened. That itch is the whole reason we keep going. So we bring in suspect number 2, and this one wears a much better suit. Blood pressure. High blood pressure is the classic destroyer of kidneys. Everybody in medicine knows it. And sleep apnea absolutely raises blood pressure. So maybe that is our wire. Maybe the snoring drives the blood pressure up, and the blood pressure over years grinds the kidneys down. It is a beautiful theory. It is mechanical. It is respectable. It connects two things we already trust. And again, the evidence partly backs him. In that same American survey, they ran the same trick. Of the whole path from the bad breathing to the bad kidneys, how much runs through high blood pressure? And blood pressure came back bigger than obesity. About 42%. Almost half. So now I have got 2 suspects. And between them, obesity taking about 30 and blood pressure taking about 42, and you might think, well, there it is, add them up, mystery solved. But add them up. 30 and 42. That is around 72. Call it 3/4 and be generous about it, because those numbers overlap and you cannot really just stack them. Even at their friendliest, the 2 best suspects in the room, the 2 everybody would happily convict, together cannot account for the whole thing. There is 1/4 of this crime at the very least, with no explanation. 1/4 of the effect where the fat and the pressure both have alibis. And that missing 1/4 is exactly where the interesting physics is hiding. That is the part nobody explains. That is the part I want. Because when the obvious suspects cannot cover the whole crime, it usually means you have been looking at the wrong scene entirely. Everyone has been standing around the blood pressure cuff and the bathroom scale. Nobody went back to the throat. Nobody went back to 2 in the morning, to the actual moment the thing happens. So let us go there. Let us go to the throat at 2 in the morning, when the lights are out and the body thinks nobody is watching. Here is what is really going on up there. When you fall into deep sleep, the muscles that hold your airway open go slack. For most people that is fine, the tube stays open, air goes in and out, quiet as you please. In a snorer, the tube narrows, and the air rushing through the narrow gap makes the soft tissue flutter, and that flutter is the noise. That is snoring. Annoying, but the air is still moving. Now take the more serious version. In obstructive sleep apnea, the tube does not just narrow. It collapses. It seals shut, like stepping on a garden hose. And here is the part that should make the hair on your neck stand up. The person does not stop trying to breathe. The brain keeps sending the order. Inhale. Inhale. So the chest keeps pulling harder and harder, sucking against a sealed tube, and no air comes. And this is not a rare little hiccup. The doctors grade how bad it is by counting these events per hour. They call the mild version 5 to 14 times an hour. Moderate is 15 to 29. And severe is more than 30 times an hour. Think about that number. To even count as one event, the airflow has to drop by more than 90% for at least 10 seconds. So a person with severe apnea is having their breathing effectively shut off more than 30 times every hour all night long. Do the arithmetic on 8 hours of sleep and you are into the hundreds. Hundreds of times a night, this person is fighting to pull air through a closed door, and every single time the body pays a price we have not measured yet. That is the scene the medical world walked right past. Everybody heard the sound, wrote down snoring, and moved on to the blood pressure cuff. But the sound is not the crime. The sound is just the tissue rattling. The crime is happening in the pressure, in the suction, in what that sealed, straining chest does to the plumbing of the entire body. And nobody put a gauge on it, because who thinks to measure the pressure inside a sleeping person's chest? Well, somebody did. And what they found on that gauge is where this case really starts to turn. Somebody finally put a catheter down into the chest and read the gauge, and the number that came back should stop you cold. Picture a soft, thin tube slipped into the esophagus, sitting right behind the heart, quietly reporting the pressure inside the chest cavity moment by moment. On a calm breath, that pressure dips just a little as you draw air in. A whisper below the room. But during an obstructed breath, when the airway has slammed shut and the sleeper is straining against a sealed pipe, the gauge does something violent. On average, it plunges to about negative 54 centimeters of water. And that is only the average. In individual events, the recordings run from roughly negative 20 all the way down to negative 147 centimeters of water. Other researchers, watching their own patients, routinely see negative 60, negative 70, and in the worst events, negative 100, negative 140. Now I want you to feel what that means, because a number on a page is easy to skim past. Take a drinking straw and pinch the far end shut, then try to suck a milkshake through it. Feel your cheeks cave in, feel that hollow pull in the roof of your mouth. That is a feeble little suction compared to what this sleeping person is generating deep in the chest, hundreds of times before the sun comes up. The whole chest becomes a vacuum chamber. And a vacuum does not stay politely in one place. It reaches, it pulls on everything connected to it. That is the thread we are going to follow, because the kidneys are connected to that chest by a river of blood, and a vacuum upstream is felt downstream. So let us follow the suction and refuse for a while to tie a neat bow on it. When the chest yanks itself down toward negative 100 centimeters of water, it does not only pull on air that is not coming, it pulls on blood. The big veins that return blood to the heart run right through that vacuum, and blood, unlike the trapped air, is happy to obey. Extra blood comes rushing back into the chest, into the right side of the heart, and the right upper chamber. The right atrium stretches. It feels more than it should. Now that chamber has little sensors in its walls, tiny stretch detectors, and they are honest but not very clever. They feel the wall being pulled taut, and they conclude one thing, the only thing they know how to conclude. Too much fluid in this body. We are overfull. Dump some. And they send that message by releasing a hormone, a small chemical telegram called atrial natriuretic peptide, which travels straight to the kidneys with a simple instruction. Get rid of salt, get rid of water, and do it now. So the kidneys, taking orders from a heart that has been fooled by a vacuum, start making urine in the middle of the night. This is why so many of these snorers get up again and again to use the bathroom and blame their age or the glass of water before bed. It is not the water. It is a stretched heart chamber sending a false alarm, and the kidney faithfully answering it. And here is the small, honest clue that ties it back to the crime. When you fix the apnea, when you keep that airway open, the nighttime urine goes down. The false alarm stops. The kidney was never broken. It was obeying. Hold that thought, because I have not yet shown you the thing the suction is reaching toward. I want to take you all the way down inside the kidney now, down past the plumbing you can see, into a single microscopic filter. Because until you understand how absurdly delicate that filter is, none of the rest of this will land the way it should. Inside each of your kidneys there are about 1,000,000 tiny knots of blood vessels, and each knot is a filter called a glomerulus. Think of it as a fistful of the finest garden hose, watered into a ball, with the walls of the hose full of pores so small that water and salt slip through, but the big proteins and the blood cells cannot. Blood comes in, fluid gets squeezed out through the pores, and that squeezed out fluid becomes eventually your urine. Simple enough. But how hard do you squeeze? That is the whole ball game, and the answer is a piece of physics so finely balanced it will make you nervous. At the entrance to that little filter, the blood pressure pushing fluid out through the pores is about 60 millimeters of mercury. That is the push. But nature never lets a push go unopposed. Sitting in the way is the pressure of fluid already collected on the other side of the wall, about 15 millimeters of mercury shoving back. And there is a second, subtler opponent. The proteins left behind in the blood, the ones too big to escape, they pull water back toward themselves by simple thirst, and that pull is worth about 21 millimeters of mercury. So take the 60 of push, subtract the 15 shoving back, subtract the 21 pulling back, and what is left over to actually drive the filtering? About 24 millimeters of mercury. That is the net force at the front door. Now walk with me along the length of that little vessel. because the balance shifts as you go. As fluid leaves the blood, the proteins left behind get more crowded, more concentrated, and they pull harder. By the far end of the filter, that protein pull has climbed to about 33 millimeters of mercury, while the push has barely dropped. Do the same subtraction at the exit, and the net force driving filtration has fallen to about 10 millimeters of mercury. 10. That is the margin at the far end of the filter, the width of almost nothing. And yet, running on that razor of pressure across 1,000,000 filters at once, your kidneys quietly clean about 120 milliliters of blood every minute, something like 180 liters a day. You filter your entire blood volume dozens of times before dinner, and the machinery doing it balances on a ledge of 10 millimeters of mercury. Now put those two pictures together and feel the danger. On one side, a filter tuned to a margin of 10 millimeters of mercury, a system designed for a calm, steady pressure. On the other, a chest that slams to negative 100 centimeters of water and back, a heart squeezing out force hormones, and, riding along with all of it, the body's alarm system going off like a fire bell. Because every time that airway seals and the oxygen in the blood starts to fall, the nervous system panics. It floods the body with the fight or flight signal, the same jolt you would get from a near miss in traffic. Except this happens not once, but again and again, 30, 40, 50 times an hour, all night, for years. That jolt clamps down on blood vessels and spikes the blood pressure, and those spikes are not gentle waves. They are hammer blows, and they land right on the kidney's own little vessels. On top of that, the repeated drops in oxygen light up a chemical cascade inside the kidney itself, a local hormone system that tightens the very vessels feeding those 1,000,000 filters, and the more severe the oxygen starvation, the harder that system cranks. Add to that the rust of oxidative stress, the inflammation, the slow injury to the smooth lining of the vessels, and you have a filter built for a whisper being shouted at hundreds of times a night. The delicate 10 millimeter margin does not get adjusted gently. It gets shoved up and down over and over until the filter starts to strain the way any overworked thing strains. At first it overfilters, running too hot. And then, in time, the fine poured wall begins to give. That is the mechanism, laid out on the table. But a mechanism is a story, and a good detective does not convict on a story. He wants to catch the thing in the act. He wants to see the kidney's blood flow actually faltering in a living person, not just argue that it should. And that is exactly what somebody went looking for, with a sound wave and a very simple question. If all this suction and all these pressure spikes are really reaching the kidney, then the blood flow inside a snorer's kidney should look different from yours. Not diseased, not yet. Just stiffer, more resistant, harder to push through. So they took an ultrasound probe, the same gentle kind used to look at a baby, and they laid it over the kidneys of people newly caught with sleep apnea, and they listened to the blood move. And here is what came back through that little probe. They measured something with a plain name, the renal resistance index, which is just a number for how hard the blood has to fight to get through the kidney. In the people with sleep apnea, that number sat at about 70.5. In the people without it, about 66.5. Now that gap looks small. It looks like nothing. But when you run the arithmetic on whether a gap that size could happen by dumb luck, the answer comes back at about 1 chance in 80. That is not luck. That is a fingerprint. And when they sorted the snorers one by one, nearly 2 out of every 3 of them had a resistance index up in the abnormal range, against only about a third of the ordinary sleepers. The kidney's plumbing in these people was already tighter, stiffer, harder to push through. Caught in the act, in a living body, on a quiet afternoon, with a wand you could buy for a hospital and never draw a drop of blood. But a good detective is never satisfied by a single witness. So they came back to those same patients some 10 months later, and they split them into 2 groups without moving them, just by watching who actually got their apnea fixed and who did not. And the resistance index, that little number of the kidney struggle, fell back toward normal in exactly 1 group. The ones whose nighttime breathing had truly been repaired, in the ones who kept collapsing their airways every night, and in the ordinary sleepers who never had the problem, nothing moved. So the stiffness was not permanent scenery. It followed the breathing. Stop the suffocation, and the kidney's blood loosens up again. Let it go on, and the kidney stays clenched. Now the suspect is not just at the scene. The suspect has a schedule, and the damage keeps its appointments. Still. A resistance index is a shadow on the wall. It tells you the blood is fighting, but it does not open the thing up and let you look at the tissue. And you cannot exactly take a living person's kidney out for the evening to examine it under glass. So somebody did the next honest thing. They built the crime, on purpose, in a small animal, in a controlled room. They took mice, and for 60 nights running, they dropped the oxygen and raised it. Dropped it and raised it, over and over, mimicking the very stutter of a snorer's blood that we have been chasing this whole time. No collapsing throat. No obesity. No blood pressure story. Just the oxygen going up and down like a saw blade, night after night after night. And at the end of the 2 months, they took the kidneys out and they looked. Here is where the case cracks wide open. The standard blood test, the one your doctor draws, the serum creatinine that is supposed to tell you your kidney is in trouble, was completely normal. Flat, unchanged. If you had tested these mice the ordinary way, you would have signed them out as perfectly healthy and gone home. But under the microscope, the kidney was not healthy at all. The little filter balls, the glomeruli, had swollen, grown larger by more than 1/10. The soft supporting mesh inside them, the mesangium, had bloated to nearly twice its proper bulk, and the urine, when they measured the protein leaking into it, had gone from under 10 micrograms to better than 40, more than 4 times the leak. The fine pored wall we talked about, the one meant to keep protein in the blood, was already weeping, and the cells themselves were dying. They have a stain that lights up a cell caught in the act of self-destruction, and in a normal kidney maybe 1/3 of 1% of the cells glow. In these kidneys it was better than 3%. Nearly 10 times as many kidney cells quietly killing themselves on orders from nothing but a nightly shortage of air. Think about what that means for a moment. The blood test says fine. The tissue says catastrophe in slow motion. The injury is real, it is measurable, it is under the glass in front of you, and it is completely invisible to the one test almost everybody relies on. That is why nobody explains this link. You cannot explain a wound you have never been shown. They went one layer deeper, because they wanted to know what was giving the orders, and they found the messengers. There are certain growth signals a kidney releases when it is being pushed to scar itself, to lay down stiff fibrous tissue where soft working tissue used to be. One of them, called transforming growth factor beta, had jumped to nearly 3 times its normal level. Another, connective tissue growth factor, the very foreman of scarring, had climbed as high as 4 times. A third, a vessel signal, was up several fold as well. These are the chemicals of remodeling, of a tissue being quietly rebuilt into something harder and less alive. The oxygen saw blade was not just bruising the kidney. It was handing the kidney the blueprints to wall itself off. And all of this, remember, while the blood test smiled and said nothing is wrong. So now we have the mechanism, and we have the shadow in the living patient, and we have the tissue opened up in the animal. 3 witnesses telling the same story from 3 directions. But an honest investigator has to ask the coldest question of all. Is this cause, or is it only company? Do the snoring and the failing kidney truly hold hands, or do they just happen to sit near each other because some third thing invited them both to the party? There is a clever way to interrogate that, using the genes people are born with, which are shuffled at conception long before anybody is fat or sleepless or sick. When they leaned on the genetic dice that make a person prone to sleep apnea, those same dice tilted every kidney marker the wrong way. The filtration rate a hair lower. The waste products in the blood a hair higher. Each one small, but each one pointing the same direction, and each one unlikely to be chance. That is about as close as this kind of work gets to whispering the word cause out loud. And yet, here is where I have to be straight with you, because the case is not fully closed and I will not pretend it is. If the collapsing airway is really doing the damage, then the obvious cure is to hold the airway open at night, with a little machine and a mask that blows a steady stream of air. And you would bet money that fixing the breathing would rescue the kidney. But the careful trials that tried to prove exactly that came back muddy. They were too small. Too many people could not stand to wear the mask and took it off. And when the numbers were counted, the clear victory just was not there. A hint, a lean, a trend in the right direction among the people most likely to benefit, but nothing you could stand up and swear to. So we can watch the kidney get hurt, and we can watch it tighten and leak and scar, and we still cannot yet promise you, with the full force of proof, that we know how to hand it back. That gap is the honest edge of the map. That is the part nobody has finished explaining. But do not let that gap swallow the whole picture, because the shape of the thing is now plain. Let me leave you where a good detective leaves you, standing over the evidence, seeing it with your own eyes. Snoring is ordinary. Nearly half of all grown people do it at least now and then, and 1 in 4 does it habitually, more men than women, night after night, and almost nobody thinks a thing of it. Most of those people, I want to be fair, do not have sleep apnea at all. The sound alone is not a sentence. But turn it around, and it gets interesting, because nearly everyone who does have that dangerous collapsing apnea, 70 to more than 90 out of every 100 of them, snores. So the sound is not proof of the crime. The sound is a clue. It is the noise the throat makes while it is deciding, some nights, whether to stay open. And whether you take that clue seriously might depend on whether you know what is sitting downstream of it. Because downstream, deep in each kidney, there is that filter we walk through together. And it does its impossible work balanced on a margin of pressure so thin it is almost a joke. At the far end of that little tuft of vessels, the net push that drives the whole of filtration comes down to roughly 10 millimeters of mercury. 10. That is the entire working margin. Thinner than the pressure change you feel riding an elevator down a few floors. On that sliver of pressure, your body cleans some 180 liters of blood a day and hands you back a life. And every single night, in a snorer, that sliver gets leaned on. Not once. Hundreds of times before morning, with every futile pull against the shut throat, the pressure lurches and the oxygen dips and the kidney braces and lets go, braces and lets go. So the next time you hear that sound in the dark, from someone you love, or from the next room, understand what you are really listening to. It is the sound of the throat closing, yes. But farther down, past the chest, past the racing heart, it is the sound of something the width of almost nothing being tested. Quietly, patiently, one breath at a time, all night long.